On modernity. I discover, looking at my life, that I've been very concerned with what is modernity, what is the modern, what is pre-modern, non-modern, both as a historian and as an anthropologist and as a human being. And that for a long time I really didn't question what I meant by that term and how it emerged. I think if you asked most people, just asked your friends and say, well, what is a modern society? And they will start and they'll think, it has cars and it has aeroplanes and it has television and it has perhaps a modern health system and perhaps a modern educational system. So the outside external features of modernity. Some may go a little deeper and say, well, it's society where they've had a scientific revolution, or it's an industrial civilization. So with such people, if you say, well, let me point you to places and you tell me whether you think they're modern, and you say, well, is London modern? Oh yes, obviously. Is Paris modern? Yes, obviously. Is Tokyo modern? Yes, I've seen films of Tokyo. And is Beijing modern? Yes. Moscow. So basically cities, industrialization, modern science, those things most people take to be what one means by modern. And they are indeed, to a certain extent, indicators and also consequences of modernity. And I was satisfied with that sort of idea. And when I studied history, we talked about the pre-modern period, that's up to the 15th century in England or 16th century, the early modern, which was a funny sort of label, which covered the period between about the 16th and the 18th. It was the period when it felt modern in its institutions, in its political democracy and so on, but it didn't have an industrial revolution. And then the modern was when the Industrial Revolution came along. So there was a 300 period in the sandwich, which was early modern. And I accepted all this, but I was intrigued by how the early modern and the modern emerged. Increasingly, and particularly when I started to study other cultures more deeply, firstly in Nepal. Nepal, a village in the Himalayas in Nepal, clearly felt non-modern. It wasn't pre-modern, it wasn't going to be modern in the industrial urban sense, but it was non-modern. It was filled with strange shamanic beliefs and religions, and its agriculture and everything felt peasant-like and non-modern, so that was easy enough. But then when I went to Japan, first I took it, oh yes, well, this is a very modern society. Their trains run immaculately on time. It's a huge urban landscape in the big cities, and the people seem very rational and modern. So yes, Japan has become modern thanks to America and elsewhere since the Second World War, if not earlier. And you might get the same impression going to China, to the great cities of Shenzhen or Shanghai or Beijing. And I didn't really question that much further. But as I studied Japan, I found these strange non-modern, not pre-modern, but non-modern features of its belief system and its aesthetics, which didn't fit at all with my idea of modernity. There were beliefs in ancestors, there were beliefs in kami or spirits and Shinto shrines and Buddhism and so on, which didn't fit at all. And even their arts and aesthetic system didn't fit. The strange sumo wrestling didn't fit within my categories, the kabuki theatre. So what was I to make of this? And gradually, as I remember lecturing to my students and having to explain to them what modernity was and what its causes and consequences were, I began to realize that modernity, there's a much better definition of modernity, which is that it's a separation of different parts of our lives. we are driven by four large impulses, emotions, needs as human beings. One is for material satisfaction and wealth, and we can call this economics. We're driven by the need to dominate and have power, and we can call this politics. We're driven by a need for social warmth and friendship and love, and we can call this society. And we're driven by a need to understand the world, to have ideas about it and about the future worlds and other things, which we can call religion or ideology. And these are four institutional areas in all societies, but in most societies, until very recently, they have all been mixed together. So an action is simultaneously, when you give someone something, it's simultaneous an economic action, a ritual action, a family action, social action, and maybe a political action. So you don't separate the institutions, and that's characteristic of pre-modern societies right up until the 19th century in many parts of the world with peasant civilizations. Modernity comes when you separate these out, and a classic case I studied was England, where I discovered that in the medieval period they had separated the economic and the social. In other words, people were free labourers and they didn't work in family groups, so it wasn't a domestic mode of production, as anthropologists call it. And so they had a capitalist economic system with markets and money and free labour. And so they'd separated those two. And they'd also begun to separate the political and the religious. This was encapsulated in the English Reformation, where the crown and the church are separated, theoretically at least. And there was no infrastructure, no system that generated all the rest, as there is in most societies. It's usually the family and kinship. And so England seemed a very separated society. And this has increased, but it was there very early, and that's why many people coming to England in the 17th or 18th century said it felt a very modern society. It didn't feel like their France or Germany. And this is something which has intrigued me ever since. What caused this separation? How is it maintained, for example, by having a legal structure, which is very early in England, which treats these different realms as separate and polices between them? And what are the psychological pains and consequences of having a separated world? Because Max Weber believed that this led to efficiency, rationality, modern science, many advantages and wealth, but it also led to the world becoming dead, meaningless, or in an extreme example, he gives an iron cage. You are trapped within too much bureaucracy, rationality, and separateness. So we bear the pain of a system which has delivered the goods, but also makes us cut off from each other, cut off from nature, and our different parts of our personality cut off, so that we are segmented. We are three-dimensional rather than four-dimensional creatures. And this, the causes of this and the consequences of this, and how it has spread unevenly over the planet, are what has concerned me in many of my books. So they have titles like The Riddle of the Modern World, The Making of the Modern World, The Invention of the Modern World. And that's what they're about. They're not about urbanism or science or modern material things. They're about this deep existential change to a separated world and its consequences. And they contrast what has happened in much of the West and other parts of the world to what has remained in places like China, in India, Japan. So that is what I think modernity is about. Thank you.